Silverpine was a town that clung to the edge of the world. It was nestled deep within the vast green sea of the Pacific Northwest. Giant firs and ancient cedars stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with moss and secrets. The air here was always damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The town itself was small, just a single main street with a handful of weathered buildings, a general store, a diner, a quiet library. The people who lived here were born from the same soil as the trees. Their faces were etched with the same stoicism as the mountains that loomed over them. They were a community bound by something deeper than just shared geography. It was a shared silence, a shared fear. Every year, it happened. The change came with the weather. As autumn bled its colors across the landscape, a tension would settle over Silverpine. It was a quiet dread that thickened the air like morning fog. Then the first snow would fall. It never arrived with a storm's fury. Instead, it drifted down gently, blanketing the world in a pristine, beautiful white. But the beauty was a lie. It was a shroud. Because on the morning after the first snow, someone would be gone. No trace, no struggle, just an empty space where a person used to be. The disappearances were a dark, unspoken tradition. A wound that never healed, but was never spoken of. The list of the vanished was long. It stretched back generations, a ghostly roll call written in the town's unrecorded history. Last year it was old Mr. Abernathy, the quiet librarian who knew every book by heart. The year before, it was young Sarah Miller, who had just graduated high school with dreams of leaving Silverpine behind. The state police would come, of course. They would fill out their reports, ask their questions, and search the impenetrable woods. But they never found anything. The forest held its secrets tight. The snow covered all tracks, both physical and metaphorical. After a few weeks, the investigation would go cold, another file added to a dusty cabinet somewhere far away. And the people of Silverpine would simply carry on. They would mourn in private, behind closed doors. They would never speak the names of the lost in public. It was as if acknowledging the void would give it more power. They moved through their days with a heavy resignation, their eyes often drifting towards the dark tree line that bordered their small world. They knew the truth, or at least a version of it. They understood the bargain that had been struck long ago. The snow was not just a change in season. It was a promise, a debt collector. And every year, it came to claim its due, leaving behind only the deafening silence and the chilling, unspoken question, who would be next? I arrived in Silverpine chasing a ghost. My name is Alex Thorne, and I'm a journalist. Or I was, before my career stalled out on the shoals of online listicles and clickbait headlines. I needed a real story, something with teeth. I found it in a forgotten corner of the internet, a cold case forum discussing the bizarre pattern of disappearances in a town no one had ever heard of. The official reports were thin, inconclusive, but the whispers online hinted at something more, something that smelled like a story worth telling. So I packed my car, left the city's noise behind, and drove north into the heart of the green, silent wilderness. I wanted to understand the town's secret. I had no idea the secret wanted to understand me too. My first impression of Silverpine was one of profound isolation. The town felt like a ship lost at sea, surrounded by an ocean of trees. The people moved with a slow, deliberate pace, their conversations quiet and brief. When I introduced myself at the diner, the friendly smiles felt brittle, practiced. As soon as I mentioned why I was there, to investigate the disappearances, the smiles vanished completely. The air grew cold, eyes darted away, the friendly chatter died, replaced by the clinking of cutlery and the low hum of the refrigerator. I was no longer a visitor. I was an intruder, a threat to the fragile peace they had built upon a foundation of unspoken horror. I tried to be gentle. I started at the local sheriff's office, a small, one-room building that smelled of stale coffee and damp wood. Sheriff Brody was a man who looked as weary as the mountains. He listened to my questions with a tired patience, his eyes never quite meeting mine. He gave me the official line. "People get lost in these woods all the time," he said, his voice flat. "It's tragic, but it's not a mystery." He slid a thin file across the desk. It was a collection of missing person reports, all stamped with the same conclusion: no evidence of foul play. Case closed. It was a dismissal, not an explanation. He was telling me to leave it alone, to go home, but I couldn't. The story had its hooks in me now. The more they pushed me away, the more I knew there was something to find. The town's silence wasn't born of grief. It was crafted from fear. It was a carefully constructed wall, and I was determined to find the cracks. I rented a small cabin at the edge of town, right where the manicured lawns gave way to the untamed forest. From my window, I could see the endless trees. They seemed to watch me, their dark forms standing motionless against the gray sky. I felt like I was on the shore of a dark and ancient ocean, and I was about to dive in, completely unaware of the crushing depths that waited below. My investigation began with a series of closed doors, literally and figuratively. I tried to speak with the families of the victims. I approached the Abernathy house, where a no trespassing sign was freshly nailed to the gate. I knocked on the miller's door, only to have it shut in my face before I could finish my introduction. The people of Silverpine were united in their refusal to speak. It was a coordinated, chillingly effective quarantine of the past. They would offer me a polite nod on the street, sell me groceries at the store, but the moment the conversation veered towards the disappearances, the curtain fell. Their faces became masks. Their eyes became stones. I spent my days in the town's small library, the very place where Mr. Abernathy had worked. The new librarian, a nervous young woman who seemed afraid of her own shadow, watched my every move. I pored over old newspapers and town records, searching for any clue, any anomaly. I found birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. But the records of the vanished were strangely incomplete. Their lives were documented right up until the year they disappeared, and then nothing. It was as if they had been carefully excised from history. A name mentioned in a school newsletter one week would be completely absent the next. It was a meticulous erasure. The warnings started subtly. The tires on my car were deflated overnight. A dead raven was left on my cabin's doorstep. These weren't overt threats, but quiet, unsettling messages. They were the town's way of speaking to me in a language I was beginning to understand. Leave. Do not dig. The silence is for your own good. One evening at the diner, a burly logger named Gus cornered me. His voice was low. His breath smelled of whiskey. "You think you're looking for a story," he snarled, his eyes dark with a fear that looked ancient. "You're not. You're looking for an ending. Go home before you find it." His words hung in the air long after he left, a cold promise of what was to come. This wall of silence, this collective refusal to engage, was more terrifying than any open hostility. It suggested a shared secret so dark, so terrible, that protecting it was worth any cost. It implied a complicity that ran through the veins of the entire community. They weren't just victims of this yearly horror, they were its guardians. They were the keepers of the cage, and they were terrified of what might happen if I rattled the bars too loudly. Their fear was contagious. I started locking my doors, double-checking the windows, and I found myself looking over my shoulder, even in the middle of the empty main street. The silence of Silverpine was not empty. It was full of screams. Frustrated by the townsfolk, I turned my attention to the only other witness, the forest itself. I began hiking the trails that snaked away from the town, pushing deeper into the woods than the locals seemed to dare. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. I found symbols carved into the bark of ancient trees. They weren't Native American carvings or modern graffiti. They were something else, geometric, unsettling shapes that seemed to hum with a strange energy. They were always found in clusters of 3, marking paths that led away from the designated trails into the dark, untrodden heart of the wilderness. They felt like warnings, or perhaps they were invitations. My breakthrough came from the most unlikely of sources. An old leather-bound journal I found tucked away in the library's local history section, misfiled and forgotten. It belonged to one of the town's founders, a man named Jedediah Blackwood, dated back to the late 1800s. His early entries were full of hope, describing the founding of Silverpine as a new Eden. But the tone shifted dramatically after the first brutal winter, which claimed nearly half the settlers. There was desperation in his writing. He wrote of the forest as a living entity, a power that was starving and angry. He described a terrible choice they had to make to survive. The journal didn't state it outright, but the implication was terrifyingly clear. Jedediah and the other survivors had made a deal, a pact with the ancient presence in the woods. They offered it something in exchange for prosperity, for mild winters and bountiful hunts. The journal spoke of a tithe, a yearly sacrifice to appease the hunger. It was a ritual, he wrote, to be performed on the night of the first snow. He described a chosen one, offered to the forest to ensure the survival of the rest. The journal ended abruptly, the last page torn out. But the truth was there, written in the frantic, spidery script of a man haunted by his own creation. Armed with this knowledge, the town's behavior clicked into place. The silence, the fear, the disappearances, it wasn't a mystery, it was a horrifying tradition, a ritual sacrifice passed down through generations. The vanished weren't random victims of a monster, they were offerings, chosen perhaps, by some dark lottery I couldn't yet comprehend. This wasn't a town haunted by a curse, it was a town actively participating in it. They were feeding the monster to keep it from their doors. The symbols I'd found in the woods weren't just trail markers, they were part of the ritual. They outlined the sacred, forbidden ground where the pact was honored, year after chilling year. The forest no longer felt like a simple collection of trees. It felt alive. It felt aware. As I spent more time on the forbidden trails, the feeling of being watched became a constant, suffocating presence. It was a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of unseen eyes tracking my every move from the deep shadows between the firs. Sometimes I would hear things, the snap of a twig just behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing, a soft whisper on the wind that almost sounded like my name. The woods were a living, breathing entity, and I was an infection it was becoming aware of. The strange occurrences bled from the forest into my life. My cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. I would return from a hike to find things out of place. A book moved from the table to the floor. A window I was certain I had locked would be slightly ajar. One night, I was jolted awake by a scratching sound at the door. It was a slow, deliberate scrape, like a long branch being dragged across the wood. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest, too terrified to even look through the peephole. The sound continued for what felt like an eternity, before finally fading into the night's oppressive silence. I started seeing shapes in the periphery of my vision. Dark, fleeting movements at the edge of the tree line as I looked out my window. Was it the wind playing tricks on me? Or was my mind, strained by fear and isolation, starting to fracture? I tried to rationalize it, to blame it on exhaustion and paranoia. But the feeling was too real, too persistent. The presence in the woods was testing me. It was pushing at the boundaries of my sanity, trying to see if I would break. It was a psychological war, and I was losing. The forest knew I held a piece of its secret, and it did not approve of outsiders knowing such things. The townspeople noticed the change in me. They saw the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden noises. They didn't offer sympathy. Instead, their looks held a grim, knowing pity. It was the look one gives to a person who has already been condemned. The diner waitress told me one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper as she refilled my coffee. The woods have a way of changing people. Some things are better left undisturbed. You should have listened. Her words were a final warning. I was no longer just an investigator. I was becoming part of the story. I was on the path that Mr. Abernathy and Sarah Miller and all the others had walked. And the first snow was coming. The day began with a change in the air. The usual damp chill was replaced by a sharper, biting cold that felt ancient and absolute. The sky, which had been a perpetual slate gray, deepened into a heavy, bruised purple. The birds fell silent. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. The people of Silverpine moved with a new urgency. They shuttered their windows and locked their doors, not just for the coming night, but as if they were sealing a tomb. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a terror that was now raw and undisguised. The time for pretending was over. The snow was coming. It started in the late afternoon. A single perfect snowflake drifted down from the oppressive sky, landing on the sleeve of my jacket. I watched it melt, a tiny star of impossible beauty and unimaginable dread. Then another came, and another. Within minutes, the air was filled with a silent, swirling cascade of white. The flakes were large and heavy, sticking to the ground, the trees, and the rooftops. The world began to disappear under a soft white blanket. The beauty of it was nauseating. It was the prettiest death shroud I had ever seen. The town's dark prophecy was coming true, right on schedule. As darkness fell, the snow continued its relentless, silent assault. The power in my cabin flickered and died, plunging me into a primal darkness, lit only by the ghostly white glow from the window. The silence was absolute. The snow absorbed all sound, creating a vacuum where the only thing I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I knew what this night was. It was the night of the tithe, the night the debt came due. Somewhere in the shuttered houses of Silverpine, a family was preparing for a loss. Or perhaps the forest had already chosen its sacrifice. Perhaps it had chosen the outsider who had dared to uncover its secrets. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and wait for the scratching to start at my door again. The journal, the symbols, the warnings, it all led to one place, the heart of the forest, the place where the pact was made. I had to see it. I had to confront it. Driven by a mixture of terror and a desperate need for answers, I pulled on my heaviest coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The snow was already knee-deep, and the world was an indistinguishable swirl of white and black. I was leaving the relative safety of my cabin and walking directly into the monster's jaws. The forest was a different world under the snow. It was a labyrinth of white and shadow, utterly transformed and disorienting. The familiar trails were gone, buried under the pristine blanket. My flashlight beam cut a weak, trembling path through the swirling flakes, illuminating ghostly shapes of snow-laden branches that looked like skeletal arms reaching for me. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, every shadow seemed to move. The cold was a living thing, seeping through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. It felt personal, as if the forest itself was trying to freeze the life out of me before I could reach its core. I followed the symbols I had memorized, seeking out the ancient trees that served as landmarks on this unholy map. Finding each one was a small victory against the growing despair. The carvings seemed to glow faintly in my flashlight beam, imbued with a strange, cold light. As I moved deeper, the sense of being watched intensified into a certainty of being followed. I could hear the soft crunch of snow behind me, always just out of sight, always stopping when I stopped. I would spin around, my light cutting wildly through the darkness. But there was never anything there, only the endless trees and the falling snow. The presence was toying with me, letting me know I was not alone. The air grew thick, heavy, with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a low thrum, a vibration that I felt in my teeth and in my bones. I was getting closer. The trees here were older, larger than any I had seen before. They were monstrous giants, their branches so thick with snow they bowed down to the ground, forming a kind of natural, claustrophobic tunnel. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty, it was full. It was the silence of a predator waiting patiently for its prey to stumble into the trap. All my journalistic detachment was gone, burned away by pure primal fear. I was no longer an observer, I was a participant in the ritual. Finally, I broke through the trees into a clearing. It was a perfect circle, unnaturally bare of trees, as if the forest itself had recoiled from this spot. In the center stood a single massive stone, like a crude black altar. It was ancient, covered in the same symbols I had followed, and swept clean of snow despite the ongoing storm. The air here was frozen, completely still. The swirling snow seemed to stop at the edge of the clearing, held back by an unseen barrier. This was the place. This was the heart of the darkness. This was where Silverpine paid its dues. And as my light fell upon the stone, I realized I was not the first to arrive. Standing on the far side of the clearing was Sheriff Brody. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was dressed in simple, dark clothing, holding an old oil lantern that cast a flickering, warm glow against the unnatural cold. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked resigned, his face a mask of profound sorrow and grim determination. He wasn't here to stop me. He was here to bear witness. to officiate. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hiss of his lantern. He was the town's keeper of the pact, the one tasked with ensuring the ritual was seen through to its terrible conclusion. "You should have left, Thorn," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the still air. "Some truths don't set you free. They just chain you to something worse." He raised his lantern slightly, and in the expanding circle of light, I saw it. The presence was not in the trees. It was the trees. The forest was not its home. The forest was its body. The shadows between the ancient trunks began to coalesce, to darken and writhe. It was not a single creature, but a collective consciousness, a vast and hungry intelligence made of wood and shadow and time. It was the hunger that Jedediah Blackwood had written about. The thing had no face, no eyes, but I could feel its attention on me. It was a cold, calculating curiosity, an ancient appetite stirring from its slumber. It had been waiting. The snow was its signal, the clearing its dinner table. Brody sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. "It's a balance," he explained, his voice hollow. "A life for a year of peace. A soul to feed the great hunger, so it doesn't take us all. That was the pact. That has always been the price." He looked at me, and I saw the terrible truth in his eyes. The vanished weren't chosen by lottery. They were chosen for a reason. "It gets hungry for new things," Brody continued, his gaze fixed on the shifting darkness. "For new stories. It grew tired of the loggers and the farmers. Last year it wanted the librarian, the keeper of old tales. This year, he trailed off, but he didn't have to finish. I understood. It wasn't the town that had been sending me warnings. It was the hunger itself. It had been interested in me from the moment I arrived. The strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched. It was the entity studying me, tasting my story, my ambition, my fear. I wasn't the one who had uncovered the secret. I was the secret's next meal. The journalist chasing the ultimate story had become the story. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My search for the truth had not been a hunt. It had been a courtship. I had made myself known, made myself interesting. I had walked right up to the monster's cage and introduced myself. The hunger wasn't just a mindless force. It was a connoisseur. It savored the nuances of its victims. It wanted the librarian's knowledge, Sarah Miller's youthful dreams, and now it wanted my curiosity. It wanted the story of the man who thought he could understand it. The ultimate irony was not lost on me, even in my terror. I had come seeking an ending, and now I had found it. Mine. Sheriff Brody watched me, his expression a mixture of pity and duty. "There's no running," he said softly. "Not from this. Once it's chosen, the path is set." He was right. The forest was all around me. The very ground I stood on was part of its being. The swirling shadows between the trees were drawing closer, not with speed, but with an inexorable, patient certainty. It was like watching the tide come in. The cold intensified, and a profound silence fell over the clearing, the kind of silence that precedes a scream. This was the cost of knowing. The truth wasn't a weapon or a shield, it was a lure. I looked from Brody to the shifting darkness, my mind racing. I could fight, but how do you fight a forest? I could scream, but who would hear me besides the man who led me here, and the entity that was about to consume me? In that final, terrifying moment, I understood the town's silence. It wasn't just fear, it was a form of protection. By never speaking of the hunger, by never acknowledging its name, they made themselves small and uninteresting. They kept their heads down, hoping the gaze of the monster would pass over them. I had done the opposite. I had shone a spotlight on myself, and the darkness had turned to look. The shadows reached the edge of the stone altar. They were deep and absolute, a void that promised not just death, but utter erasure. I thought of the empty spaces in the town records, the names carefully excised from history. This was how it happened. The hunger didn't just take your life, it took your story, absorbing it into its ancient, silent consciousness. My last coherent thought was not of fear, but of a strange, chilling clarity. I had found the truth. And the truth was hungry. As the first tendril of shadow touched my boot, I finally understood the true secret of the snow. It doesn't just cover the tracks, it erases them completely.